the closer we all are, the more we can feel like we're having a conversation together as opposed to us talking at you. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you all for coming to the panel, Digital Ethics and Privacy, Moving Beyond Compliance. So I'm Sheila Jambakar. I'm Associate General Counsel at Twilio, and I head up the privacy program. Before I introduce the panelists, I wanted to provide a little bit of background on the impetus for this session and also provide some context for the panel. As we say at Twilio, let's start with why. So with recent privacy scandals such as Cambridge Analytica, there have been renewed concerns that legal privacy frameworks that regulate technology and use of data simply can't keep up with the pace of technology itself. And so there's a question of what can be done to prevent the yet unforeseen negative consequences that could arise from technology. The law is just frankly not necessarily the greatest at protecting against the future as of yet unforeseen risks. So this is where concepts like digital ethics come in. In fact, next week, the EU privacy regulators are getting together at the International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners, and digital ethics is going to be one of their primary topics of focus at that conference. So the topic is quite timely. So with that background, I am pleased to introduce the three panelists today. With me, we have Michelle Richardson, who is the director of the Privacy and Data Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Thank you, Michelle, for coming all the way out from DC to join us. Next, we have Shahid Buttar, who's the director of grassroots advocacy at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, based here in San Francisco. And last, but certainly not least, Freddie Martinez. Freddie is an activist and an engineer, and also director of Lucy Parsons Labs. So we do have a voice of a developer here as well. So the purpose of this panel isn't to dump knowledge on you as the audience, but rather to spark people into thinking about this topic. We want this to be a discussion. So even though this is going to be silent disco style with the headphones, we invite you to add your voices to the discussion. So if you have something you want to say, raise up your hand. And we will try to get a mic passed to you so you can add your voice to the discussion as well. We do want this to be interactive, as sort of awkward as it might be a little bit in the silent disco setting. Before I get started, though, I wanted to get a little sense of the audience. Who here is a developer? Great, awesome. How about people who are involved in making product strategy decisions? Got some people there too, so definitely overlap. Awesome, thank you so much. Wanted to get a sense of who we were talking to and level set. So let's get started. Maybe I'll kick this off with you, Michelle. I feel a little funny, like I'm doing like a game show here. Pardon that. So maybe we just level set and let's, in the context of data privacy and builders of technology, how would you define digital ethics? What does digital ethics mean?
Well, to me, I find that these days I'm usually defining ethics in their breach. And we see so many examples now of how we've had failures, just systemic ones too, right? Not bad Apple problems, but the failure to build products that respect people's differences and the things that happen in their lives. So to me, data ethics is about, first and foremost, understanding that data is not neutral and it affects people differently, and therefore all products treat people differently. That as designers, people should step back and consider the differences, and that people have different threats in their lives, different point of views, and it will be affected by technology differently. And then make a proactive effort to account for that. And part of that is actually reaching out to people and understanding what they care about, how they view privacy and what's important to them, and just responding to it, right? Not be debating them about what privacy means to them or whether it's reasonable, but that some people have bigger privacy concerns than others. And for me, that means we will get better products over time.
And hey, Freddie, from your perspective, I mean, one of the questions that comes up when we talk about things like ethics and moving beyond compliance, as a developer yourself, what do you think if someone were to say, is it really fair to expect developers to be worried not just about making sure that their products are legally compliant, but that they're actually thinking about ethics as well. Well, what's your take on that perspective?
Can everyone hear me? Good, great. So, back before I was doing computer science full time, I was actually a physicist, and and that's how I got into computer science, was because I was really interested in solving some really interesting computational problems, and I had to learn some physics along the way. But very quickly, as a physicist, you don't get away from this problem of ethics. In fact, you're almost within the first year and a half, you're required to take classes because physicists built a nuclear bomb and will have to forever live with those consequences. And that's not the case in computer science. And I think that that's going to change, and it's going to change probably sooner rather than later. I have a colleague who wrote a really interesting article that was called "Can Mark Zuckerberg Be Tried at the International Criminal Court?" And it was about sort of all the ways that Facebook facilitates things like there was an article in the New York Times this week about there's a genocide that's happening in Myanmar, and the army itself is using Facebook to incite violence. And it was kind of a thought experiment, could this actually happen? And the answer was no. And I don't think we're going to live in that world for much longer. I think we really are going to see just a clash of societies that is being facilitated by technology. And so I don't really think this idea of what is an ethical consideration that I have to make as a designer. I don't think I am going to live in a world much longer where that's a question I can avoid. So we need to start thinking about that now, so that we have answers when people come, if the ICC were to come to Facebook, So that's how I consider it, and that's a lens that I view these things through.
So I take it you would say that it is fair to expect developers to start thinking about compliance. Should you had something to say to that?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. I mean, I think the part of the question here is to be aware of the context in which we operate. And the historical context is one that is pervaded by exclusion, whether of data sets that are training algorithms that might be under-inclusive, or whether that's limited access to the information, on the behalf of the public and users about the platforms that you might be developing. There are obviously a set of legal restrictions that are quite permissive, and I think ultimately what you're asking is to what extent does the law suffice as a guardian of user and public rights? And I think we've seen in one context after another that it's entirely inadequate, which is to say it does fall to some extent to the people building software to consider the rights both of their users and their end users, and ideally externalities beyond them that might impact the public. And I think part of the question about digital ethics is the awareness of externalities, the proactive consideration of those externalities before embarking, blindly stumbling through a thicket that will create any number of problems later. To one of the sort of implications here, I think it might feel unfair to the extent these are issues beyond the narrow projects that you might each be embracing, but a correlated concept to introduce here is that we are not merely developers or product strategists or, in Michelle and my case, lawyers. We each have capacities that include, for instance, being parts of your respective communities, being an agent beyond the enterprise in which you're working to build a culture that either will respect digital rights or which will, over time, by one increment after another, erode them. And just to consider your capacities beyond your professional one. And this is a theme I'll come back to later, but there are a litany of action opportunities available to you, both in the context of your professional work and also outside it. And digital ethics can inform both of those modes of and theaters of action.
And can I actually give an example of this? So right now, digital identity is big in DC, right? And we're hearing about it from all different parts of the ecosystem, and a lot of people are proposing to find some sort of a digital ID that the government would recognize if you put it on your phone, right? And so a coalition of entities who would want to use this sort of ID came in and pitched this idea to us. And so we asked, well, in the US, 15% of adults still don't have IDs, right? And it has affected their rights to vote, access certain facilities, and it's really had a real effect in their lives. So what are you going to do to make sure that this next generation, right, is accessible and usable for everyone? And the answer was, well, this isn't going to work for everybody. And that's the thing, right? It's not that it has to work for everybody. It's just that it can't keep failing the same people every time for the same reasons. And so you're basically taking an inequity that exists in the physical world, and they're just going to digitize it, right? And they have an opportunity maybe to find a way to do it better. And they don't have to. There's nothing in the law that would force them to close that gap for the 15% of Americans who don't have a driver's license or photo ID right now. But I would hope ethics would say that you would consider that, right, as you're building that out to make sure that you're actually closing the digital gap too when you're starting over. I mean, this is what's so exciting to me is we're actually starting over on certain things, right, when you put it in the digital world. And so why aren't we doing better instead of just trying to take the old way we did things and just make it maybe a little bit easier for the type of people where things were easy already?
So maybe this is a good one for Shahid. Whose responsibility, though, is it, if you're working within an organization, whose responsibility is it to make the ethical choices when building technology? Is it the organization? Is it the society as a whole? Is it the individual? What's your take on that?
I mean, I certainly think the organization has a responsibility. As society relates to these questions, that's kind of what law and policy are. And, we started the conversation from the premise that our society's decisions around these issues have been either unexpressed or inadequate or permissive, or, that as much as the field of user rights might remain undefined, there's been a great deal of opportunism among commercial enterprises to presume, for instance, user consent to data collection, or to deny notice to users of content moderation, right? These are all principles where you have ethical considerations come into play. And to the extent our society's decisions have left too much space to operate, I think that the responsibility falls to organizations. But back to my earlier point about our various capacities, each of you are part of organizations, and organizations are composed of individuals, which is to say, for an organization to make a decision that might be difficult or might leave commercial cards on the table will require the articulation of these interests by individuals in those enterprises. This is precisely why I'm so excited to speak with you, because engineers and developers, you set the default within your respective projects, within your respective products. And certainly in any organization there will be contending pressures. For instance, I could see a predictable dynamic where people perhaps responsible for marketing or monetization might have an interest that might differ from someone who'd be very concerned about the rights of end users or the public. But the rights of end users or the public aren't represented in those conversations and decision-making spaces unless someone raises those concerns. And then that begs the uncomfortable question: if not you, who? And if not there, where? And if not at the outset, when? And this is exactly why I think it's a responsibility for everyone in the ecosystem to proactively consider these questions. And maybe just a corollary here, I think it can feel very uncomfortable to think of yourself as the sole guardian of the public within your profit maximizing enterprise. But you don't have to think of it that way either, because in addition to your many capacities, you're also a colleague to any number of people. You're probably a friend or a mentor to any number of people in your organization. Having conversations outside the context of a specific decision, outside a flashpoint, ideally before these controversies might become potentially pitched in your organization, that's the real zone of opportunity that I would encourage you to consider. Is what are the forums in which you can raise your concerns informally in trusted spaces with colleagues, so that when the opportunity might emerge to have a potentially challenging conversation or decision-making process in your enterprise, you're not doing it alone. What this basically relates to is grassroots organizing within your companies. And that takes concerned people to find and recruit and inform and work with other concerned people. And the fact of the matter is, you are the only ones in the room. And if you do feel these concerns, and if you feel like the issues around end user empowerment or the erosion of public rights or trust in the platforms are issues that matter to you, I would really encourage each of you to have those conversations in your companies. And I'm happy to leave this aside for now, but I'd love to come back later to ways, at least at EFF, that we are eager to support your voices. I'll leave it at that for now.
So Freddie, you look like you're itching to say something, and I'd love to hear from your perspective as an engineer who's been in these companies and had that opportunity to play that out.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I'm not going to advocate that everyone, goes back to their companies and like sets themselves on fire to, be
Thank
the
you. Please
privacy
don't set
person.
yourselves on fire.
What I found most of the time was there were just defaults that it was just some decision that was made 6 years ago. I was on a platform team and we were moving stuff into the cloud, and I would say things like, "What's your data retention policy?" And the answer was inevitably like, "We don't have one," which means that we're going to keep everything forever. And I was just like, well, we could set one, and that's all that you really need to do sometimes, is just be the inquisitive engineer who just asks questions about why are things built the way that they are. And that was my sneaky way of getting us to like stop collecting data. But really it was just about begging the question and trying to really understand why things are the way that they are. And secondly, I don't think people should go out and I don't expect everyone here that leaves a room to go and like organize all of their coworkers and say, what are all the issues that we need to solve right now? But I do, think you need to go and like talk to your colleagues about what are the things that they think are important. One of the things that I find really interesting over the last maybe 2 years is how tech communities and engineers inside tech companies have been organizing around digital issues. So there's the Tech Won't Build It campaign, which is, holding tech companies to account when they want to do business with like ICE or Customs and Border Patrol, or build a Pentagon project, or build AI visions for drone campaigns. And it really was the engineers at those companies working with other colleagues in the industry saying like, this is an issue that we just won't work on. So people have, gotten major defense contract canceled because of pressure from within the industry. And I think that trend is really encouraging, and we should be thinking about again, I'm not saying that we're all going to go out and do this, but it's an opportunity, and it's been in the news for a long time because people that are in relatively privileged positions are just saying like, well, I'm not going to abuse this position anymore, and try to hold tech companies to account. So I think those are examples of like what people could be doing. And again, there's a spectrum there. One is just asking questions and working on design decisions, and the other one is really like building campaigns, which you can find where you want to be on that line.
Right, and I think that's where ethics seems daunting to a lot of people, because I think it's sort of like, what's my moral responsibility? Do I build bombs or not? And very few people will ever make that decision, right? But when you go back to your computer, you're going to make that decision every single day, right? And people are going to count on the decisions you make, and there's going to have downstream effects that you can't predict, right? None of us can. So there are some decisions that you can make as you're building products, right, that may protect people or be better practices. And that's what we're hoping people can exercise as they build these products. So I kind of joke with people and they say, well, we don't have a privacy officer, we don't have a CPO. And I'm like, yes, you do. His name is Peter, and he's a subcontractor, and he actually works for you only 3 hours a week. That's the guy who makes your privacy decisions, right? Like, someone's making these decisions, even if they're not thinking about them, or if they set the default 10 years ago. But there's really no objective way to build any product, right? There's no decision you have to make. So if you approach them with fresh eyes, you're able to do things different.
So switching gears a little bit. I think there's a question. Oh, yay, there's a question. Can you, or a comment. Excellent.
Just touching on your earlier point, do you think Apple's announcement this morning will lead to a reset in the industry, and if it will have flow-on effects within developer teams?
Did you? We're going to need someone to repeat that. Lauren, can you repeat that to us? Because we can't be.
I'm going to try it without that. Can you hear me?
That's better. If you speak up, that's great.
Okay.
Okay, because they already heard the question initially.
I don't think they heard the question.
Yeah, we can't hear.
I'm going to repeat the question for the sake of the recording, if nothing else. Can you comment on Apple's announcement this morning, and if you think that will force a reset in the industry in regards to privacy and data retention? So for those that didn't read the press this morning, Apple announced that they've now launched a website where every single Apple customer can log in and see exactly what data Apple has on them in an open and transparent way. Do you think that will lead to a reset of expectations within the industry? And is there any sort of flow-on effects within developer teams?
That'd be great.
Yeah, sorry again for the logistics, and I appreciate you working with us. I certainly think that decisions by major platform companies, and especially big ones like Apple, Google's decision on Project Maven, they lift the bar for the rest of the industry. So Apple has chosen, for instance, to make, in this case, user transparency and the data that the company has about users a competitive differentiator. It's similar. I mean, I can think of another arena very recently where, well, not very recently, but 2.5 years ago, at the beginning of 2016, Apple was engaged in a very prolific fight against the Federal Bureau of Investigations to guard end-to-end, well, in this case, device encryption. And the willingness to make user security a paramount value and to tie their own value proposition to it, I think, forces the rest of the industry to respond. Because for Apple, it's not merely an ethics consideration, it's ethics and marketing. And to make a higher ethical standard an object of corporate differentiation suggests not only, we've been describing the conversations you might have internally as if they are entirely about user rights and the public rights that aren't represented in the room. Apple's announcement and the controversy with the FBI and the insightful position that the company took then, I think, indicate a further lever you can pull, which is to say it can be profit maximizing to stand back from a technical line of opportunity especially if that's the object of some marketing attention, if that ethical standard is one that might compel other users and platforms. I do think Apple's decision is certainly, in that arena, a positive one. I think any time a platform makes a decision like this, it puts others in challenging positions. Will it be enough to guard the standard? I really have no idea, but I am very excited to see it happen.
I have no thoughts.
Thank you for that. I guess then follow on to that, though. Technology is global. However, our ethics, digital ethics, are they global or are they culturally specific, given different values that could differ between different cultures? I mean, you look at things like in the EU, how they respond to hate speech versus free speech, or privacy versus the right to be forgotten, and the right to be forgotten versus free speech. If you're building a global technology, is there a global set of digital ethics?
Well, I would say that's a critique that's often made of human rights and civil liberties in general, though, right? Are you colonizing other countries with your American values, and is that respectful? However, I think civil liberties always move in one direction, which is more protection, more control for people. So it's, I think it's fair to move in that direction with technology too, right? Even if not every single country or every single society implements it in the exact same way. But I would say even if our cultures are different, the way data is abused always seems to be the same, right? No matter who the target is, and repressive governments or opportunistic companies who have data breaches or collect too much information, a lot of these things can be mitigated with collecting less data, or at least putting a purpose limitation on it or an expiration. Right, and this is what we want. We want you to be able to offer the best services that someone asks for, but not have so many side consequences, right? To have so much collateral damage out there. And those are the type of decisions that you can make that will benefit anybody, no matter what culture they're from.
I mean, another thing to think about here is the surrounding context. It might be the case, and certainly, the GDPR's, for instance, articulation of a right to be forgotten and the reciprocal obligation that places in the restraint on free speech, the takedown implication that it implies. Those are, I don't want to describe them as esoteric problems, they are real. I guess the point I'd want to draw our attention to is just the global rise of autocracy and unilateralism and, quite frankly, corporate dominations of all parts of every political process across the world's democracies. In that context, I think it's not at all presumptive to do whatever you can to empower individuals, users, and the public. And sometimes those values come into tension, right? If you're at a B2B enterprise, your users might not be the public. So thinking about, how do the ways in which you might be empowering or disempowering your users, how does that empower or disempower the public? And there might be the case that there are places in the world where user empowerment or might conflict with a local norm. Those are among the things to, I think, take into account, but I don't think we need to, as developers, technologists, and lawyers, attempting to build platforms for global application, aim to allow the local standards to essentially eviscerate the opportunity for digital rights to be respected in other places. Think also here, the way the GDPR basically forced a different compliance regime for platforms that do business in Europe, at the risk of balkanizing the internet, that's kind of what regional regulatory frameworks do. As long as that is the direction, we should at least attempt, I think, to lift what tides we can. And I don't think we should let the concerns about cultural hegemony necessarily intimidate efforts to try to lift the ethical standard. There are plenty of holes in the bucket, to otherwise diminish the extent to which that project might prove successful. And I think local standards are worth respecting and considering, but I don't think they're necessarily. I'm trying not to use a word that starts with T and ends in rump. Should necessarily be paramount to the other values that might be at stake.
So it sounds like you're kind of moving in this direction. Do you see that there is some guiding principle for digital ethics in the context of privacy or handling personal data? Is there some North Star or pithy phrase?
In my mind, it's the responsibility to make sure that the tools you're building are tools that can be used by people instead of tools that use people. And that breaks down into lots of things. Data collection is one important norm, setting retention limits of the kind that Freddie was talking about, use limits of the kind that Michelle talked about, dissemination limits we haven't talked about, but that's a big one. Under what circumstances is data that you collect shared with whom? I mean, that's a really critical question. That a lot of times, Freddie's story illustrates how in many use cases it's just not determined. It's a completely ad hoc decision that comes up in the context of some controversy. Thinking about that in advance is another one of the principles. So proactive, pre-controversy consideration of collection limits, retention limits, dissemination limits, use limits. Those are some of the at least important arenas, and if there was a guiding principle, I would just say it's empowering users and considering those externalities on the public beyond them.
We've got another question or comment from the audience.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the discussion.
You'll have to speak up for us. The rest of everybody can.
So my question is, what obligation do consumers have to utilize these tools, or is there any information or data about consumers trying to utilize these tools and whether they're effective or not? Sometimes it can seem, at least to me, like it's a bunch of class action lawyers running around trying to do a smash and grab on some company. I'm sure the truth is in the middle, but what are we actually seeing consumers trying to do, and how effective is it?
Yeah, maybe Michelle.
Well, I think one of the biggest problems with our current system is that we put the burden of protecting people's data on users, and the system we've built does not allow users to do that in a meaningful way, right? The notice and consent model we have is no longer meaningful. The internet is not optional in 2018, right? Digital services. There's a school district in California, for example, that only communicates with parents through some sort of Google platform, right? So guess what? You're 5 years old. You're in kindergarten. You're a Google client kid, right? And so these things are just no longer manageable from an individual perspective. So what does that mean? That means we have to put the burden on someone else to make systemic changes. And that's why I feel comfortable putting the onus of this on the companies to make the decisions and do better is the only way that we're actually going to change the ecosystem that we're in. Yeah,
I mean, the way I think about it, I mean, as a developer or as a person who does like security engineering, it all seems very like, you know how it seems like a deck of cards that we're building here that can always crash, and we're always just trying to like hedge that card is placed like right in the nice spot. I mean, I remember working at a company that was hacked, and the customer data was stolen, credit card data was stolen, and I came in one day and they were like, hey, we're dealing with this hack. You can't tell anyone. Sign this non-disclosure agreement. And let's just say that did not go well for that company because, it was important to me that consumers be protected. There was through no fault of the consumer that their credit card data was stolen. And I think a lot of what we need to be doing is building systems that are resilient to things like for example, resilient to things like hacking. For example, how quickly can you you can't rotate your social security number, right? But we can build systems that are, sort of self-healing or self-regulating to some degree by making smart design decisions. And I think putting the burden on consumers really just shifts the blame to people who really have no choice. Like for the most part, don't have a great choice of like the number of apps I have on my phone, right? Because I need them to do my work and I need them to do whatever. And so what we really should be thinking about is how do you build things that are secure by design, and that includes things like design decisions about what are the same defaults that users are presented with, how are those set. And so there's this idea that's been talked about in the last few years about secure by design and what does that actually mean. And that could be a UX decision, it could be a UI decision, it could be a business decision. It could be, a choice of tools, but I think we're going to hear more of that in the future in sort of these developer circles.
Well, and I will just point out that's also why we need privacy laws in this country. Those are the only things that have protected users in the past, and they haven't always done a great job, right? We'll pass a law and it will sit there for 30 years before it's updated, so they can age out. But if people are not going to use their, immense power over our data and how we interact in the world and our rights and opportunities, that's why we need a baseline federal privacy law, or the states. We've seen this, right? I mean, I don't know that there have been that many class actions.
I fear where a federal privacy law might go.
Yes, yeah, we have a different opinion on that, but I think we agree there needs to be compulsory laws here
Agreed.
to protect people's data in one form or another. And because there really is no recourse right now, right? If you're a user, I don't know what you do. I mean, I guess people maybe have some opportunities under California now, but unless you are...
we will at some point.
At some point, if it ever goes into effect at this rate. But it's, there's just no recourse for a user. And I just can't say enough, you just can't opt out of the internet in 2018. We can't keep telling people just say no to products, right? Turn off your Facebook. Fine, so what if you do? If you walk down a public street, you're being caught on camera and recorded, and it's going over the internet. I mean, we are just in a different world now. We have to accept that our lives are digitized, and so that means we have to expect something different from our companies.
I absolutely agree with that. Just to add to the conversation, I think the question around customers' responsibilities is insightful. Notice of breach, the hypo or the real case, I guess, that Freddie shared, it's a perfect example of an arena where the customer doesn't, without notice of breach, the customer has no agency, right? You can't make informed decisions as a customer if the platforms you're using hide from you when your data's been stolen. And that's not, another thing to note about notice of breach is that's not a product development conversation. That's a response to an incident out of any of your control. So even if you're not on a product team, you still have opportunities potentially to impact your enterprise's social responsibility decisions. I think there's a further piece here, and I'm striking a little bit sort of beyond where you were raising the question, but Michelle's absolutely right that the internet, despite I think many of our hopes, has presented people with a proliferation of voices and perhaps over time a diminishing set of choices, right? There was a time, and to some extent, some parts of the web are still the Wild West, but the corporate dominance over the user experience that most users enjoy is a fact of our recent history. And in that context, I would encourage each of you to think about, in the vein of empowering consumers, if you have spare cycles or timeouts out of work, think about contributing, particularly the designers among you, to free and open source development projects that provide consumers alternatives to corporate platforms. These are basically platforms and software owned by no one, which is to say no one can take advantage of them. They have their own problems, obviously, and among them often usability is one of them, which is why I'm encouraging the designers among you to consider that as an arena for volunteer time. But empowering users and giving consumers opportunities to make informed decisions is almost a core element of the invitation around digital ethics. I think consumers have a responsibility to do their best in a context in which individuals, I think, are not well poised to parse a EULA, for instance, an end-user license agreement. Like, I'm a lawyer, and quite frankly, I could dedicate a week to reading one of those, and I still wouldn't understand what I was reading. So I do think, to Michelle's points, it's unfair to expect consumers to do that heavy lift themselves, especially in the context of information being relatively hoarded and closed by the companies. This is another reason why algorithmic transparency is so important in so many contexts, to make sure that algorithmic decision-making, and then beyond that, machine learning and AI, aren't turned against the public. The only way we can know that is through transparency that would enable consumers and other enterprises, for that matter, to make informed decisions respecting these kinds of principles.
And it sounds like what I'm hearing is there's choice, but then there's meaningful choice, and those aren't necessarily they're sort of choice on paper versus is it actually a meaningful choice. And today, if you're dealing with a service where is it really a choice not to have the internet? If that's if you're dealing with a choice of Comcast or Comcast, if Comcast says this is part of your user agreement, did you really have a choice, right? So that we need to make a distinction between those two things. Freddie, I'm going to ask you a question pointedly as the developer here. Can you be an ethical developer working on an unethical product?
So that's a easy one for me to answer because I'm a Marxist. I don't think you can separate your work from your sort of analysis of the world. I think not. And whether or not we want to believe this, we become invested in our jobs. We spend, a third of our life there, and you become your colleagues. You become, you become the people you surround yourself with, whether you want to or not. I've faced this problem in my career where I was working in high-frequency trading markets, and I hated it, but it was like the only place that hired physicists except for bomb manufacturers, and I was like, I'm not going to go build a bomb. So I went to go work there, and, I was like, I'll do it for a year, then I'll get out. And then it was like another year, and then it was another year, and I think I was there for about 3.5 years, and I was just miserable. But I was like, well, I guess I'm making decent money, and the projects that I was working on were extremely interesting technically. How do you shave off a fraction of a microsecond in this very complicated technical stack? And so for me, it was intellectually stimulating, even though I hated it emotionally, and I knew that I really just wanted to get out of there. And that is just like a consequence of like who you happen to be in the rooms with and what are the things you're working on. And then finally, I forget what happened, but something happened, and I was just like, that was the end. Oh, I remember what happened. It's not an interesting story. But yeah, and whether or not we want to think that we're somehow the one who's actually not like that, right? We all think we're all super exceptional, and we're not drinking the Kool-Aid, and we all agree to some degree internally. And so my answer is like no, because I've had the experience, I've lived in an experience where I found that I was working on things that I really didn't like. And I go back to the Tech Workers Coalition and Tech Won't Build It. And I think that really is like a sort of consciousness that's being developed, and actually it's like a muscle that's being worked out right now about all the things that you can't do as an ethical person working on unethical products. And so I think we're going to continue to see that. And so hopefully people take some of that away with them.
I've got a up to you, please.
Well, I was going to say, I would actually say the opposite, and I don't want people to feel like
Good,
they are
spicy. Let's have a
in
spicy
one
conversation.
bucket or another, right? I mean, that's too much pressure, and that's not how our world works, and you're going to make a million decisions in the rest of your career about what information to collect, who can use it, how far it goes out of your ecosystem, and every time you make that decision, you're putting a weight on one end of the scale, of whether it's an ethical decision or not. And there'll be a lot of them in any one product, right? And all we need is for you to do the best you can on each one of those decisions. Maybe you'll lose. Sometimes you'll get overruled by your boss. Maybe you're building a product that actually needs the data. That's fine then, right? But in the grand scheme of things, we're just asking that people make better decisions.
And maybe I'll take, apropos to how we're arranged on the stage, a middle position here where I think it is conceivably possible to be an ethical actor within an ethical enterprise if you take proactive action to try to raise a flag. And, when we were talking before about the opportunity to talk to your colleagues before a controversy, I think that's one of the critical differences. Are you a change agent within the enterprise, or are you going along to get along? I mean, the conundrum that Freddie was raising about, earlier in your career reminds me of being a corporate lawyer when I first came out of law school. And, a lot of what we did didn't necessarily align with my value perspective, but when we managed to work with a then 26-year-old Green Party small-town mayor in upstate New York to bring the country's first marriage equality case on the East Coast and throw 15 lawyers at it, there are ways to mitigate or complicate the ethical implications of your work. And I go back also to this principle that you're not just employees at the company you work for. You also can mentor people. You can diversify the hiring pipeline. There's a million ways that you can take action beyond whatever your discrete responsibility in your paid work is. And I think that is the essence of being ethical, is showing up in the variety of spaces that you might have access to in a way that, maybe to turn up the dial here, the essence of liberatory praxis and being an ally is to recognize privilege and to strategically redeploy it on behalf of people who are less fortunate. And I think, each of you enjoy a privilege if merely in being part of the spaces that you each have access to. And I think the essence of being an ethical actor, regardless of the enterprise you're in, is being aware of that, being aware of the historical context, who's not in the room, being aware of the future context, how might what you're building be used against people or limit their choices or skew a potential set of outcomes, and doing whatever you can within your individual reach and working with others to try to build your shared power within your organization and within your industry to make an alternative. I mean, in my mind, the holy grail here would be some set of people working across enterprises to come up with an alternative to an advertising-driven revenue model for the internet. Right? If there was a way for users to use a global information infrastructure without a million different actors having a monetary incentive to track everything that they did, that would be a profound contribution to humanity. It would be akin to the invention of the internet that was then effectively co-opted as a tool for global surveillance.
I think we have a question from
I'm
the
sorry,
author
I'll shut up now.
comment.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure. I'll go. Thanks again for coming out today. I wanted to ask another question, calling back to some of the earlier topics we were talking about on sort of taking on ethical responsibility. So one of the classic debates in tech and ethics is innovation versus regulation. And, a canonical example of this being rideshares like Uber and Lyft, kind of hitting the ground, breaking into cities, not paying attention to regulations, and then kind of worrying about the consequences of that later while they can get their product up and running. Like Chicago and London banned them for a period of time. New York, taxi drivers essentially lost their retirement savings in the form of their medallion values go into a fraction of what they were, which were unintended consequences, to be sure. But what I wanted to ask about and get your take on is essentially, like, in situations like that, whom does the onus fall upon to, like, A, rectify these unintended consequences? Like, is it the regulators, or is it the tech company to massage out? Like, is it the laws that are wrong to begin with, or is it the burden of the tech companies to kind of play within the existing rule set to make their inventions happen, innovations happen? just kind of curious to hear your opinions on that.
Who wants to start?
Maybe just to differentiate between those two companies, if you contrast Uber and Lyft and their respective expansions of their markets, one of those companies has been much more respectful of local regulation than the other. And I think that there's a way to innovate in a way that is respectful of public decision making. And ultimately, I think maybe that's the question is, disruption of industries is one thing, disruption of and I would say that Uber's historical decision-making in this arena is particularly problematic because, there have been settings where local regulators have set forth a paradigm and, the company will thumb its nose at it. And I think that's different than participating in a rulemaking body, taking advantage of opportunities that might exist, but the respect for the public decision-making process, I think, is critical there. In terms of who does the responsibility fall on, I think it's shared. It's shared among consumers, it's shared among platforms, and it's shared among public bodies. Thinking about, for instance, opportunities for job retraining, targeting disrupted workers or workers in industries that have been disrupted, that's a real opportunity. I don't think it's fair to expect enterprises to internalize all of the public costs of their actions, but I do think that there's a lot of opportunities here for creative collaborations between the public and the platforms and individuals within the platforms who might care about these issues. One of the themes that we've reiterated here is just the idea of shared responsibility, and I think it's important not to try to put it on any one actor in the ecosystem, but rather to decentralize it.
Well, I think we're about to get the hook, so maybe one final word from Freddie before we wrap up. I'm getting the time and the music, so maybe a final parting thought, Freddie?
Oh, sure. So I think one of the things that we've all tried to express in different views is we're not expecting any one person to go out and be like the Edward Snowdens of the world or the Chelsea Mannings. Those people do exist, and they, are incredibly brave, but they're also very rare, And so I was recently listening to a talk by Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, and he said something like, you train people how to get jobs, but no one is ever taught how to risk their job or risk their livelihood or risk, losing your job is not like the end of the world, right? For many people, well, sorry, that is a privileged thing to say, but for many people, in our tech space, you could probably find a job within a month or so. But the fact that you're never asked to consider, is this a line that I'm willing to cross? Or is this a line that this is where I'm going to make my ethical stance? This is just a thing that's never imparted on us. It's certainly not in school, certainly not in our careers. And so I think one of the things we've tried to express is just we're not asking you to be the whistleblower of the world and expect you to be the front page of the New York Times, but we do expect people to just find their positions of what they think they can work on and not work on. And that is just a design choice that we have to all make as human beings.
And thank you so much for the time and also listening and also sharing your perspective. So please if you wore the headphones, put them on the chair so they know to clean those up for the next crew. So thank you so much to the panelists. I appreciate your time.